When I was on the TV, when it was live, I said, I refuse to believe this is a lost generation. Hope is a refusal to accept the situation as it is. And if we tackle the drive as to why these things happen in the first place, we will and can turn this around.
Well, welcome everybody. This is Simon Gilbert with Inspired, and I'm very excited this week because we've got with us Patrick Regan. Hi, Patrick.
Hey, how you doing?
Brilliant. So by means of brief introduction, Patrick has got an OBE. He got that, I'll let him tell the XLP story coming up now. And also now he's running Kintsugi Hope, which he founded with his wife, Diane. I think that's all I'll say by means of introduction, Patrick. We'll just get straight into it. So tell us about your background, your childhood, what led you to where you are now?
Yeah, I think in some ways I was brought up with Christian parents who really loved God and brought up in sort of the church culture, I guess. Mm-hmm. But I think for me, everything changed when I was 16 and I went on one of these sort of short-term mission trips to London, and we went to a place called Cardboard City, mm-hmm. which at the time was underneath Waterloo Bridge, where literally at that point there were hundreds, if not more, of homeless people. And I remember sitting in a circle with these guys, just talking to them, and one of them had begged enough money to get a hamburger, and they were passing the hamburger around the circle, each taking a bite out of it each. And then they handed it to me, and I was like, what are you doing? I have everything. You have poverty, and yet you're sharing the little you have with me. And then written on the walls of Cardboard City were the words, "Welcome to reality." Someone had written it in big red paint. Mm-hmm. And I remember going back to the airbed I was sleeping on that night and just saying, God, I don't want to play the comfortable life. Break my heart for the things that break yours. And I always look back as that being the most pivotal moment, I guess, growing up, where I just chose to do life a little bit differently.
So you'd already made a profession of faith. You're already on track. Did you ever sort of have some wacky rebellion, or were you always essentially a good kid?
Yeah, I guess not really. I didn't really have a wacky rebellion. I struggled like a lot of Christian kids do, I think, because I think sometimes the temptation is that if you've got brought up in the church culture, then you don't struggle. But actually you do struggle. You do struggle to do the right thing. You do struggle to make the right choices at times. And when you don't obviously rebel, I think it causes those feelings sometimes, if you're not careful, of just that isolation, of feeling different, of trying to work out who you are. So I think all those things, like I know a lot of young people go through, was more what I was struggling with growing up.
Mm-hmm. And so 16, you have that experience in Cardboard City. What were the next steps?
So as soon as I was 18, I was like, I want to go and live in London. And I was like, so I moved to London to do a gap year. And while I was there, there was all sorts of things kicked off. But while I was there was a stabbing in the local school. Mm-hmm. And the local school phoned the local church up and said, we really need help to get the moral fibre of our school up. And the vicar knew how tough the school was, so didn't really fancy it. So sent me as the local youth guy to see what I could do, And I arrived in this school that had about 60 mother tongue languages in it. It was just so diverse. And it wasn't that the kids were thick or stupid at all. It was that they didn't understand what was being taught. And there were so many complex issues within the school. I mean, amazing school in some ways. So I just really went in with, as local church, we believe in serving our local community. What can I do to serve? What can I do to help? And that's when they said, well, we've got all these mother tongue languages. We need help with reading and literacy. So we started helping with that. We knew there were a lot of gang issues in the area. I remember meeting a kid wearing a bulletproof vest underneath his school uniform. Mm-hmm. He said to me, I could be dead by next week. And
so was this Peckham?
It was around that area, yeah. Oh. And so we got him some help. And I guess God just broke my heart, really, for the inner city. And so I found 17 people to give me £25 a month. Brilliant. And from there, I started the charity XLP.
Was that when you were 18?
It was just after I was 18, yeah.
Wow. So 18, 19, you've already started a charity.
Yeah, it was a struggle. What we did is we for a few years we operated under the church's charity number, but we were sort of funding it separately, if that makes sense. And then eventually we just became our own charity. So yeah, it was an interesting time, and me and my wife, we were just living off this estate. We planted a church on this estate, and and it was shocking in some ways because I'd had a very sheltered upbringing in many ways, and I really felt that I was just learning so much from these beautiful people that had such challenging and different upbringings. And I realized, Simon, I couldn't be like them. I couldn't pretend that my childhood was like their childhood.
Yeah.
But I realized that people respect integrity and trying to be genuine and not trying to be something you're not. And I think that was a really important lesson I learned straight off, and to really just try and go with an attitude of humility, of trying to understand, trying to be consistent as well. I think that was a big thing.
Yeah, when you talk about them passing you the hamburger, and in general, whoever we meet in life, isn't it? We need that humility because there's always stuff to learn, and often the most unlikely people teach us so much. I mean, you're just making me think of at one of the heaviest times in Burundi. I got into a sort of, it was a death camp. 10 people were dying day after week after month, and it was an illegal encampment of 40,000 people. There was no toilet. The government at the time, the military, had forced all these people, 300,000 people plus, into various camps, and it was hell on earth. And the rebels had just sent down the chopped off heads of the soldiers they killed. It was horrific. And before I left, I preached. And then before I left, they said, you need to get out of here because they're just around the corner. It's very dangerous. But I was taken into this hovel, a tin shack, and with pierced roof, because the soldiers actually pierced the roof so that people would die quicker, get rain, get more disease. It was hell. And I was given a meal of beans and rice. It was the most costly meal. It was the most grim, rancid meal. I didn't want to eat it. I knew that half an hour later I'd be back in the capital. I could stuff my face from a packed fridge. And here were these people and their brokenness teaching me so much, giving me their everything out of their nothing. As so often we give our shrapnel out of our, total affluence, and very humbling. There's so much to learn, isn't it? I worked in the Hamburg's red light district for 6 months for the Sally Army, and just but hard yards. I mean, it was honestly that it was very depressing. It was very hard to see lots of tangible fruit because you're coming from a place of people who've got so many issues and so much brokenness and so much sort of systemic injustice, isn't there? And they've got such
absolutely.
So talking to that, I mean, well, first of all, what does XLP, what does that stand for?
XLP stood for wanting the young people to excel in every aspect of their life, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. It's just the whole to create a sense of positive futures for them, and particularly our thing was to have a sustainable impact on poverty and educational failure. That's where we really felt God was calling us to have an impact.
And was it gut-wrenchingly sort of 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, like I just talked about?
Yeah, all the time. I always described it as a beautiful mess, and lives are so complex. And, I think it's not black and white, is it? And I remember once we were doing a report on girls that were involved in gang culture, because what we were finding is that these girls were being sexually exploited at one level, but hiding drugs at another level. And so they were both victims and perpetrators. And that's what I found quite complex in the inner city. It's really hard. And I think people found it really hard to know how to deal with that. People didn't know whether to arrest them or give them a counsellor. It was like, it's just not black and white. And I remember one day we were doing like a research paper on what we should do and how we should respond, because again, there's no statistics for these girls. And we know that most male gang members will have 1, if not 2, sometimes up to 5 girls that maybe they're connected with in some way, and in various forms of relationships. And so I got a meeting together with Sapphire, which is the sexual violence department of the police, how to deal with that, and Trilogy, which is the department of the police, how to deal with the hardest to reach young people. And then we had clinical psychologists there, and we had crime intervention people there, and we had this conversation. And it was fascinating because they said to us, you know what? You're the only ones that can reach the invisible people. And I was like, my colleague was like, what do you mean? And the clinical psychologist was like, well, until I get referral from a GP, I can't do anything. And then the police guy was like, well, until they commit an offence, we can't do anything. And I was sitting there thinking, this is crazy. So what happens is with these kids is we wait for something to go really badly wrong in their lives, and then we throw everything at them. And most of it they can't understand or access. And then they said this: you can reach invisible people because you live in the communities that you serve.
Yeah.
So you build relationship in a completely different way to the way that we do. And then the clinical psychologist said this, which I thought was just fascinating. They said, there's 3 things you need to know if you want to see transformation in a person. They said, number 1 is trust. They've got to be able to trust everyone, particularly in the inner cities, but not exclusively so. Mistrust institutions. We don't often trust the police. We don't trust social services. We don't trust the media. You got to build trust. Secondly, you got to build belief that change is possible. That a lot of these people in these desperate situations have just gone, this is my lot for life. There is no hope. You've got to nurture that belief that change is possible. And then thirdly, they've got to come to a recognition that they need to change their attitudes and their behaviors. So I'm sort of hearing this and I'm thinking to myself, so you're telling me that the secret to transformation is trust, belief, and change.
Sounds familiar.
I've heard that somewhere else.
Yeah, brilliant.
and so I just thought that was fascinating. That even like people are recognizing, whether you have faith or no faith, that they are the 3 ingredients that people need to see a turnaround in their lives.
And so, were you able to operate clearly as a follower of Christ? I mean, did you have to sort of hush that side up to access funding? Do you know that sort of dynamic that a lot of organizations have to play with?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was a bit, if I'm really honest, I think it was a bit mixed at times. And as XLP grew bigger and bigger and bigger, and there were sensitivities as well, because, you're working in areas like in terms of education where you need to sort of really respect the sort of culture of the school and the situation that you're in. But, it grew. We had 3 double-decker buses, which would go onto estates every afternoon and every evening of the week because estates, particularly in London, were so territorial. You were never going to get some big youth centre that anyone was going to come to. We did this project, which was fascinating, with MTV, and they had this program called Pimp My Ride. I don't know if you've ever heard of it.
No.
And so basically it's the most bizarre program. What they do is they take a rubbish vehicle and they pimp it and turn it into something crazy, like just totally ridiculous. And so we approached them and we were like, if we give you a police riot van, would you pimp it and turn it into a mobile recording studio so we can take it on the estates and work with some of the hardest to reach kids in London?
Brilliantly creative.
And so I bought this police riot van off the police for £1. And they pimped it, and it became the most watched program on MTV. I think it's still on YouTube.
Class.
And my guys, they're amazing. They took it on the estates where gunshots were often ringing out, and and just amazing. Did some amazing work with it, and I think they've still got a couple of those going on as well. And so it was and we saw people come to faith. We saw people connect in just beautiful ways, but yeah, it's a beautiful mess. It always is.
My kids, their youth worker, Stuart McLaughlin. I don't know if you came across him, but he was converted. He was converted in Peckham, and he's a brilliant guy, and lots of horrific stories. I mean, I think those of us that don't live in the city almost struggle to believe that this stuff is going on, and it's side by side with rich neighbourhoods, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So go on, give us your best, sort of glory stories that are so encouraging from that, sort of dark areas.
I think there was this one particular girl who it was just a funny story really, that literally just had the most complex life that year. I mean, literally everything you could possibly think of. And we started working with her, started mentoring her. She'd gone from sort of bottom of the school, and we managed to get her an apprenticeship at Barclays. And there was this moment where, I don't know how it happened, but I was speaking at Barclays next to the CEO of Barclays, right at the top of the tower. And so I arranged for him to interview her, not sort of really letting him know the full story. And so he interviewed her about her story, and she talked about the complexities of violence, of abuse, of self-harm, of all the things that she'd been through. And then he looked at her and he went, so what do you want to do in the future? and she went, well, I want your job.
Brilliant.
And he was like, well, what do you mean? She goes, well, I'm working for you. Now, this like thrilled him because it made him look really good as well.
Yeah.
And, but just that sense of trust, hope, change.
Mm-hmm.
And I just saw it in many of the kids. You know, I remember another guy who he used to cut his hair himself. He's incredibly poor, very angry, used to punch the walls, and a massive hole in the wall where he'd punched it once. And you know, he came to faith. He was our most regular person at our club. In fact, I remember he used to print off flyers that I sent him, and he'd laminate them and he'd give them out around the school. You know, he was like the best evangelist, much better than me. He was reaching his own friends. And you know, he came in the end. He worked for XLP. He got married. And he's still doing youth work today. So you know, there's some lovely stories. But to be honest with you, for every, I guess, quote success story, there are probably about 20 heartbreaking ones.
Yeah.
And I think that's the nature of the work.
It is, isn't it? That's the reality. Yeah. So you handed that on several years ago. Is it still going well? Is it in good shape?
Yeah, it seems to be doing really well. Yeah, I think it's probably changed a bit, but like I think those guys are doing a great job. Yeah, doing really well.
And we haven't, well, I mentioned at the start in the introduction, but you got an OBE. Was that because, particularly during the riots when things kicked off, in what year was that? I forget.
That was like, do you know what? That was like 10 years yesterday.
Oh, wow. Well done.
Yeah,
celebrate that.
And, yeah, it was a weird one. I was actually in Tottenham yesterday. And so it was a weird thing 10 years ago that it all kicked off. I don't think it was particularly to do with the riots. I think that was just something that we were obviously working in all those areas at the time. And I think, you know, when the riots kicked off, I had young people texting me, telling me, like, it's all going to kick off in Peckham tonight. And it was funny. I think everyone was driving out of London that night, and I was actually at my parents' outside London, and we drove back in. And it was weird because I just felt like it was such a desperate time, because you basically have young people destroying their own community. That's effectively that was going on. And it was just a perfect storm, high unemployment, all sorts of things going on. And just a lack of hope, really. It was a really desperate time. And I remember I got called up to go on to, I think, BBC and ITV and even CNN. And I remember the news reader saying to me that she just believed that this is a completely lost generation. And I sort of listened to her. But when I was on the TV, when it was live, you know, I said, I refuse to believe this is a lost generation. Hope is a refusal to accept the situation as it is. Yes. And if we tackle the drive as to why these things happen in the first place, we will and can turn this around. And that little phrase, I refuse to believe this is a lost generation, just went nuts on social media. Wow. And then everyone started talking to me like, oh, you're the hope guy, right?
Oh,
you're
brilliant.
the guy who thinks there's hope. And so from there, I started doing lots in terms of the media. I'm starting doing lots in terms of works in policy, you know, talking to prime ministers, talking to people of influence within the government around what can be done in terms of helping some of our most vulnerable young people. So yeah, it was the riots. I don't think I had anything to do with the OBE, but I think it was an interesting time that drew attention to some of the challenges that our young people were facing.
That is so inspiring, mate. And yeah, I mean, it's walking the walk, and I like various themes that really resonate with me. I'm always saying everything's about relationship and credibility, authenticity, being on the ground, getting your hands dirty, in for the long haul, no cheap and easy solutions. I mean, it's all that, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So was it with a sense of reluctance that chapter ended, or was it very clear that it was meant to be?
No, it was really clear, and I think that, like a lot of activists, I lived on the edge of burnout, and I often feel like a lot of us are by personality with the sort of people that I always say it's like, if you get your mobile phone will work as well on 100% as it does 10%, and there's nothing that my phone can't do on 10%. That it can do on 100%. It's exactly the same. The fact is, it just doesn't last very long. And I think a lot of us get ourselves in situations where we get close to burnout. We rest a little bit.
Yeah.
We're up to 10% and we're ready to go again. But you can't sustain that. You can't live like that. And it's unhealthy. And you get into a lot of unhealthy habits. And I certainly did that. And I feel like also within the church, sometimes there's a temptation to always preach the show reel. Always, one success story after another success story. And yet we don't talk about the behind the scenes. We don't talk about the sleepless nights. We don't talk about the anxiety attacks. We don't talk about those areas where we feel like we just can't go on anymore. We've had enough. And so I remember there was a time, particularly when, in fact, the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge had come to visit XLP like twice in a year. So and I was standing next to Catherine and all these photographers. There must have been literally about 200 photographers in front of us. And these photos went around the world. And the show reel looked brilliant.
Yeah.
But in those photos, I was really struggling with anxiety. I was really, really struggling. And I suddenly realized that, it's the behind the scenes. And I can't just carry on and expect things to change. And I went through a time in my life where everything went wrong. I had to have major limb reconstruction surgery twice on my legs, which meant I need to get my legs broken in 3 places and big external frames drilled into my bones. And my wife had to sort of almost like, it sounds a bit weird, but she had to sort of change these measurements on these struts that went into my leg. So she was basically stretching me for months on end to straighten my leg, and it was so painful. And I knew I had to do it twice, which psychologically was hard.
Yeah.
Kids got very ill. Kez got a condition called HSP. Dad got cancer. He was meant to be in hospital for a week, ended up in hospital for 9 weeks. I mean, he survived. But, it was just one of those things. And I started to unravel, I think, Simon. And I started to think about, where were all the sermons I'd heard about mental health in the church over the last 20 years? And actually, I hadn't heard of any. And when I had told people that I think I'm struggling with anxiety, people just say, well, you just need to trust God a bit more, as if I'd never thought of that idea.
Yeah, yeah.
or you need to pray a bit harder. I was praying about as hard as I could.
Yeah.
Or worse, you've got some sin or something you haven't repented of, and and then that ends. You just end up being really unhealthily looking for things that just aren't there. So it was really a tough time, and it was the image of Kintsugi that really helped me through. It was this image of brokenness, and instead of hiding the scars, God does something with them. And Kintsugi's actually means golden joinery. So if we break a pot, we mend it with super glue. We hide the scars, we hide the cracks, we pretend it's all okay. In Japan, they put a gold powder in the glue. So instead of hiding the cracks, they make a feature of them. Arguably, it becomes more beautiful for being broken. And we allow God into areas of our lives and in a depth that we've never done before. And that was definitely the phase that I was in. And ultimately, that's what Kintsugi Hope came out of.
Hi folks, I hope you're enjoying the podcast as much as I am. If you are, can you spread the word? Can you gossip it to your friends? And if you want to help us in terms of covering the cost of the podcast, all monies ultimately go out to our work in Burundi, which is, amongst other things, the hungriest country in the world. So we'd love your support for that. Then please go to greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired. Now let's get back to the podcast. Yeah, so it was New Wine 2018 that I listened to you talking about that. So that was the launch of Kintsugi Hope. Just in terms of, so did you break down? Was there like a year between XLP? How long did you recuperate?
Yeah. I mean, I didn't leave XLP because I broke down. I left XLP because I felt God was telling me it was time to let it go. And that was funny because I was a founder, right? And many founders just don't let go. So it was like I was looking around for all the other founders that had let go of their ministries, and I couldn't really find hardly any actually.
No, I haven't. So I think I'm on track.
The funny thing was, I was like, there was all my friends. I mean, like Steve Chalk was running Oasis still, Mike Pilavachi, Andy Hawthorne, all these guys, they're still doing what they were doing, And I was like, what's wrong with me? But I clearly sensed God said, it's time to let go.
And that's so good.
And so I did. And so yeah, and so I took a little bit of a sabbatical in between, and then we started Kintsugi Hope, and with a real emphasis on creating a space to promote positive mental health, but also to really support people who have felt isolated and lonely. And of course, this was all pre-COVID, so we had no idea at the time that it was just going to be so needed over this last year. So it's been incredible, actually. It's just been amazing.
And you founded it with Diane, and you've mentioned her very briefly, but obviously she's a wonderful woman who's carried a heavy load with you and in your weakness, for you. Tell us a bit about her. I mean, did you get married super young?
Yeah, we did. So we met when I was 15, and she was 16, and got married at 21. Mm-hmm. And Diane grew up in Papua New Guinea, actually, so very different culture to growing up here. But I think you're right. I think in one of my books, When Faith Gets Shaken, Diane wrote a chapter called Secondhand Smoke. Mm-hmm. And the whole concept of it is secondhand smoke can still kill you. And, so many people over the years have literally died by being near or being in pubs and bars where there's been lots of smoke. Yeah. And I think sometimes there's a big emphasis on caring for the person that's obviously going through a challenge, but the people around them are really struggling as well. And so Diane really wanted to do something about caring for the carer. And looking at how we do that, and she's had her own challenges, but she's definitely been that person. And so, yeah, it's lovely now for this season to be working together at Kintsugi Hope.
And is it very much both of you in it?
Yeah, so there's 11 of us on staff now, and the whole idea is what we wanted to do is when I left XLP, I said to God, I would do anything for you apart from run another charity, right? Because I never want to fundraise ever again.
I know what you're saying, yeah.
And it was funny. I felt God say, and it sounds a bit cheesy, but it's definitely true. Don't think charity, think movement. Mm-hmm. And I was like, what does that mean? So actually, in my sort of time between XLP and Kintsugi, I studied movements. I looked at things like park run. Where in England there are hundreds of thousands of people that run in parks every week. They've just started up again. Mm-hmm. And what was fascinating about it was there was different cultures, different ages, different abilities, different ethnicities. And they had this thing where you belong, but you don't have to fit in. Mm-hmm. And then I looked at choirs, and particularly this thing called rock choir, where they start choirs all over the country, and they hire Wembley Arena, which takes about, 15,000 people every year. And again, different cultures, different ages, different abilities. You belong, but you don't have to fit in, but you come together. And then we looked at things like Weight Watchers and Slimming World and Alcoholics Anonymous, which I found so inspiring, particularly back in its origins, and just so had this real Christian sense of reliance on God. And so, to cut a really long story short, we wrote a 12-week program based on Alcoholics Anonymous, but for mental health, for well-being. Mm-hmm. And what we thought, wouldn't it be amazing if we could train the church to deliver this 12-week well-being program in their communities? And so we started doing that. It was just me and Diane originally. We trained some churches. I think before COVID, there were about 40 churches. And it was incredible, Simon, because churches were being quite creative. They were going, some of them were like quite nervous. They were going, we'll just run this as a home group and we'll see how we get on, Yeah. Others were like, well, we work with the homeless. This material is perfect, because we were dealing with anxiety and shame and forgiveness and perfectionism, all these key issues to well-being. So they started running with the homeless. Others started running it. Someone wanted to run it in farmers markets, because a lot of farmers have high suicide rates because of the loneliness that they face. People wanted to run it with vulnerable women. And so it's just started to spread. And then COVID hit, and I'm like, we are doomed. We were like, this is going under now, because we've only just started, really. But the opposite happened. We moved all the training online. And over the last 18 months, we've trained over 1,000 people now to run Kintsugi groups. So I don't even know how many people in Kintsugi groups. It must be 3 or 4,000 at least at the moment. And they're running everywhere, in coffee shops,
Fabulous.
in pubs, obviously on Zoom, in sports clubs, in businesses, in schools, in universities, in churches. And about a third of the people coming to Kintsugi wellbeing groups aren't from the church. They're people,
Yeah.
who are just struggling. And I guess if you do Alpha, you sort of got to be interested in faith. Whereas I feel like anyone can come to this, and most people don't care if we pray at the start and we talk about God, and because it's part of our story, right? So yeah, it's just been an amazing journey.
And it's interesting because we did a podcast a few weeks back with Nicky Gumbel, and he was saying that he didn't think Alpha would work online, and people, lots of doom mongers with COVID, and that it was all going to fall apart. Whereas actually, going online has led to exponential growth and more courses and more people and better sort of hanging in rate and results on every level. So totally blown away by that, and that's been your experience too, being creative. You got a good team around you of creatives.
Yeah. We actually wrote the 12 weeks in learning styles. Because again, we were really conscious that often material that comes out of the church is great for white middle class. And what we wanted to do is write it in learning styles, so actually our leaders can go, I'm doing it to a bunch of blokes in a pub, I'm going to do it in this particular learning style, or I'm doing it in a university, I do it in this learning style, or I'm going to do it to some, we had one group run for survivors of abuse recently, and I'm going to do it in this learning style, or choose 2 or 3. So hopefully we can, have that innovation, have that creativity. One size doesn't fit all. The UK is incredibly diverse, and we're looking at some other countries now as well. So again, just looking at how we do that in a way that is relevant to the culture that we're trying to reach.
And have you had sort of any stories fed back to you, beautiful stories?
Yeah, I mean, we've had so many, and recently just had one just 2 weeks ago actually, of someone Facebook me saying that they'd just been baptized and they didn't have a faith before the Kintsugi group, and it's just gone all the way through, and just talked about their mental health and how God has just been so good to them. We've had stories where people started the group with quite suicidal thoughts, but not telling anyone, because sometimes when you're feeling that low, you feel ashamed of it, so you keep it secret. But then just found love and community and support, and as a result went on to get a job. They were unemployed. Incredible. I've had people who weren't going out of the house because they were too scared. This one woman, after the week on resilience, she was on a mobility scooter because she had a bleed in her brain when she was younger in life, which just left her in a really bad way. But so she wasn't going out. She went out twice during a year, but after that she's like, I'm on my mobility scooter every day now, I'm getting out. So lovely things, and just a really simple one actually from the other day as well. There was this lady who, she was doing it on Zoom, and she'd lost her kids into foster care, so she basically had a judge say that you're not fit to be a mum. And so for the first 3 weeks she just sat there with all the lights off in the room. There was just a silhouette. You could make out her there was someone there, but you couldn't see her face. And week 4 in the Kintsugi groups is on shame, and we talk about how Brené Brown says shame loves silence, secrecy and judgment, and stepping out of shame is about owning your story. And so she listened to this, and then week 5 all the lights were on.
Oh, beautiful.
And she could see her face for the first time, and I was like, that's what Jesus does. Jesus always dealt with people's shame before their guilt. It was almost like it was that crippling shame of why has this happened that he dealt with. And so I think that's beautiful. If we could see more people step out of shame, I'll be happy.
Amen. Tell you what, can you just slowly repeat that quote? Sometimes you need to hear things twice to absorb them, don't you? Say that again.
That shame loves silence, secrecy and judgment. And to step out of shame, you need to own your story.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely for some of us, isn't it?
Mm.
Many people listening will relate to that. So come on, let's do it, people. So if someone's listening right now, what would you say to them in their shame or in their brokenness, their darkness, their despair, their anxiety, all the different range of mental health
Yeah.
issues? What would you say to them now?
I think there's many things. I think struggling doesn't mean you're a failure. It means you're a human being. And I feel like sometimes that people, who are struggling, they feel like it's always their fault. And don't get me wrong, choices have consequences, but there's a lot of stuff that happens to us that we have no control over. And particularly in many, many tough communities. And I feel like sometimes our biggest critic, if we're honest, is ourselves. I often talk about the inner critic. My inner critic will tell me things that I would never dream say to anyone else, And I remember one of the things that I had to learn, and this was really hard for an activist, is I had to learn about self-compassion. And I remember once my counselor said to me, you need to understand self-compassion. I was like, I'm an activist, don't be stupid. That just sounds selfish. I'm a bloke. I don't do baths. I don't do candles. I want to change the world. And she sort of looked at me and was like, you have completely got the wrong idea of what this is all about. And she said this: self-compassion is talking to yourself the way that you would talk to your best friend, because you would never put you never put your best friend under the pressure that you put yourself under. And actually, self-compassion takes discipline. It means you're probably going to have to get to the gym. It means you're going to have to watch what you eat. It means you're going to have to get out and, and do things that may actually make you feel a bit uncomfortable. And as I've gone around the country, touring with the different books that we've written and stuff, I just realized that people have really beat themselves up. And I think God wants to really come in and, love your neighbor as yourself. Or if you can't love yourself at all, then actually it's it's the most important commandment. So we've got to get those three things in order.
So go on, repeat those three. It's some of us are thickies. We need to hear it again.
Well, love God, love your neighbor as yourself. It's self-compassion is talking to yourself the way that you would talk to your best friend. And I think that if you can get hold of that, then actually you'll start to make some positive changes.
Yeah. That's real wisdom. Thanks. And you mentioned books. So the latest one is Bouncing Forward. Do you want to share a bit about the books?
Yeah, well, I wrote, before Bouncing Forward, I wrote this book called Honesty Over Silence, and it had a tagline of "It's okay not to be okay," which I really believe. But I had so many emails, which were both heartbreaking and heartwarming afterwards. And so many people going, I've never read anything by a Christian before that's so honest, and then just telling me their story. A lot of people that have been damaged in church, to be honest, by poor theology around mental health, and had walked away from their faith as a result. And after reading all these emails, I was like, I do believe it's okay not to be okay, but I don't want people to stay not being okay.
Yeah.
I want them to thrive in the midst of adversity. And you know this, Simon, but it's just the incredible stuff that you've done. Adversity never goes. It means we have to find a way of living and thriving within it. There will always be blessings and battles. You're never going to have one without the other. And, Rick Warren talks about the railway tracks, good stuff, bad stuff, always until God comes again. That's the way it's going to be. And but imagine how I felt when I was saying to my publisher, I want to write a book about resilience, thriving in the midst of adversity. And this was 2 months before COVID hit. And then COVID hits, and I was like, oh my goodness, I don't think I can write this now. And then the unjust murder of George Floyd, and it just kept, and I was like, how on earth? And it was fascinating because as I started to research, people describe resilience as bouncing back. And you'll hear it on the news every week. Will the economy bounce back? Will the church bounce back? Will education bounce back? Will the NHS bounce back? And I was like, I'm not sure I want to bounce back. I've been changed by what's happened in the last 18 months, for good and for bad. Why would I want to go back to my pre-trauma self that went through less? Why would you want to go back to yourself 2 years ago, which had been through less? Because you've learned stuff, right? And then I found this little quote. I've forgotten who it was from now, but I found it. And it said that resilience is less about bouncing back and more about bouncing forwards. It's about going, let's take what we've learned, the good and the bad, the trauma and the joy and the tears and the laughter and whatever it's been over the last 18 months, and let's learn to bounce forwards. And so I wrote a book about resilience, courage, and change, and on what does it mean to bounce forward at this time.
A very needed message for sure. And is it going all right? People resonating?
Yeah, it's been really good, and we've started started doing in-person events again. So we're going to do a big tour in November, like 11 different shows, and just just trying to help people. There's a chapter on grief which I think is really interesting. Learning to grieve well, and I think that's really important. And so often when we talked about grief, we talk about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who talks about these stages of grief that we all go through, and with the last stage being acceptance. And I remember us saying in the book, I found that really unhelpful because I felt like the other stages I was stuck in, or I kept going back a stage, anger, denial, and all these other stages. And actually learning that grief is something that is messier. It comes in bursts. In fact, the hospice movement, they use this illustration that if you imagine grief as a ball that moves around a box, and in the box, there is something what you call the pain button.
Mm-hmm.
And when a bereavement happens or when something happens, is the ball bashes into the pain button all the time. It just feels overwhelming. But they said as time passes, the ball doesn't disappear, but it gets smaller. So it hits the pain button, but it hits it less regularly. And that's often how grief affects us, So my wife the other day, she was really sad. And I was like, why are you sad? And she's like, I miss my grandma. And I was like, she died 20 years ago. And she goes, I know, but today I'm thinking of my children and I miss my grandma. And I was like, the ball's hit the button. It may not be every day, but it's hit the button and it's caused a sense of grief. And I think when you realize that, it helps you go, okay, I know how to manage this now and get through it. So there's lots of things like that in the book, which I think have been really helpful for folk.
Well, folks, I think I'm definitely going to read it, Bouncing Forwards. And, oh, mate, there's so many pearls and jewels as you're sharing, and time's running out. I'd like to talk a whole lot longer. I resonate with, I think we've got very similar DNA as pioneers and stuff. If I'm asking Patrick Regan, what's your dream? Yeah, where are you at right now? What's your dream?
I think my dream is I want to see a world where emotional and mental health is understood and accepted, with safe and supportive communities for everyone to grow and flourish. I said to God, God, if the next big move of your spirit comes in some warehouse somewhere in the States, and Christian TV are going to come and they're going to beam it around the world and we're going to call it revival, I think I might quit. But you know what? If it can come in small groups, in brothels and in homeless shelters and in prisons and in universities and schools and pubs and clubs and nightclubs and parks, and if it's not led by the great and the famous and the charismatic, but maybe by the fragile, the humble and the courageous, then that's a part of movement I want to be part of. And so I guess, they say that vision is the art of seeing the invisible that produces passion and energy in you. And I think that gives me life, just to see, let's do things differently, and let's see God's spirit move in the grassroots of community. Like you say, through relationship, because that's how God is designed. He's the relational God.
I love it when you're epitomizing what the podcast is called, inspired. You're inspiring me. I've got a cheesy grin on my face. Last question, which ties into the dream stuff. But one thing to be honest, my biggest battle in 20 plus years in engagement living in Burundi was to still be hopeful because of so many sucker punches in the mix, so absolutely. Much evil, so much, and yet we know the end of the story. So are you hopeful, and what does hope look like?
Yeah, I am, and I totally relate to what you said, because I feel like sometimes I've felt those emotions as well. And I remember the one thing that really helped me was I remember walking along once, and I think it was Mike Yaconelli who said this, that if you look down, you see these grey, lifeless concrete slabs, you know, and that is experience for so many people. It's grey, it's gloomy, but he said if you look closer, wherever there's a gap, there'll be grass growing through it, and straight in towards the light. And you can bend down and you can pick up that grass, but you won't take away its root, and it will just keep growing and keep growing, and eventually it will crack the concrete. And I feel like hope for me is seeing the grass grow through the cracks. It's like acknowledging that there is pain, acknowledging there is greyness, there is stuff that's going on. But wherever there's a tiny, tiny, tiny gap, there'll be grass trying to get through, and one day it will crack the concrete, and God will come back, and He will create a new heaven and a new earth, and reconcile everything to itself. So that I hold on to that image, you know, and I also hold on to the image. Corrie ten Boom, you know, she was like, when she was in the concentration camps in Auschwitz and other places, not Auschwitz, she was in another concentration camp. But when she was there, she found God in the concentration camp. And I'm like, if you can find God in a concentration camp, I'm going to keep finding God in the situations that I am in, and keep praising Him in the situations I'm in as well.
Amen. Right. Well, let's call it a day. Patrick, it's been such a pleasure. How can people get in touch with you? How can they support the ministry? What do you want to plug briefly at the end now?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, we're not like a complicated charity. We're like train churches to run Kintsugi groups in their community. As simple as that. And that if you want to outreach into your community in terms of ministering to people in the areas of emotional, mental health, communicating the gospel through that, then just go to our website, which is www.Kintsugi Hope. Kintsugi is spelled KINTSUGI, KintsugiHope.com. All the information on groups is there. There's like info sessions where you can just come online and chat to some of our team for an hour if you want to know more about it and stuff. So yeah, I mean, that is it really. And we'd love to help and support and train and fan into flame where we can.
Amen. Brother Patrick, cheering you on in the spirit, mate. Keep going. Love what you do. And thanks so much for your time.
No problem. Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, folks, hasn't it been awesome? Another fantastic week. I just love doing this. The beauty of the diversity of the body of Christ, involved in so many things and so many different pies, doing beautiful stuff. Next week, we've got another fantastic guest. I'd love it if you enjoyed it. Please gossip it. Can you ask 5 mates to listen to next week? You know, just that's how word gets around. And there's so much bad stuff going on. We need some good news stories, don't we? That's the whole purpose of Inspired. In the meantime, have a great week. God bless you. Toodaloo.